Hello and welcome to our next week of the story of Christianity. This week we're going to be looking at the 20th century American church, especially after the World War II period. We're going to be looking at the various themes that have affected the American culture, especially as it relates to church history. Many of these things are still very much present with us because as we move into the late 20th century history, people who were alive in those days and the ideas are still very much prevalent within our churches and within our own mindsets. So we're going to break this down by decade. We're going to first be looking at the post-war period after a brief recap of some of the events going on in the 20s and 30s, and look at what I'm calling the Christian consensus, or the vague sense of Christian affiliation that happens after World War II leading up to roughly 1963 with the assassination of JFK, and how this functioned as a de facto American civil religion. We'll then be looking at the 1960s and 70s and the cultural revolutions of this period that stem out of some of the contradictions of the 1950s and the various anxieties produced by the Cold War. We'll then move into the 1980s and 90s, where we will stop our discussion and look at the kind of debates and struggles that have come to be known as the culture war. We'll talk about all of this as we go through. Hopefully by this we can see the general sweep and trends that have caused the American church to be what it is today as they've been produced throughout the past 70 years. So just to give you a brief recap of where we left off with the American church history, we looked at the Fundamentalist-Modernist controversy in the 1910s through the 1930s. In this, conservative Christians were largely pushed out of the mainstream denominations and institutions, especially in the North. And the mainstream of Christian theology came to be the standard liberalism, which we defined more or less by von Harnack's discussion of the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the infinite worth of the human soul. The historicity of Christianity, its main doctrines of incarnation, Trinity, Second Coming, were largely passed over, with religion becoming much more of an ethical dimension and promoting social causes as opposed to generally personal conversion. Those who worked against this came to be known as the fundamentalists. Remember, I said that's a very tricky word, but in this period, historically, it means those who held to the five fundamentals of the faith: the reality of miracles, the virgin birth, the second coming of Christ, the reality of the resurrection, and the substitutionary nature of the cross itself. We looked at some of the main figures in this. One of the most important that you should remember is J. Gresham Machen and his lead up against this movement. His most famous attack on it is his work, Christianity and Liberalism, that we talked about before. And in this, he argued that, in fact, Christianity and liberalism are two distinct religions. Because of this understanding, which was widely held across the fundamentalist camp, fundamentalism, after its defeat, retreats, not just from the church or institutions, but more or less retreats from the culture to create its own enclaves, its own Bible colleges, and it moves away from kind of its previous position as evangelicals, engaging in social action and preaching the gospel widely. The end of fundamentalism as a powerful movement within the society came with the Scoops and Monkey trial, which largely made the fundamentalists look foolish to the rest of the world. Throughout the 1930s, fundamentalists would be pushed out of the institutions in the North and out of the public sphere itself. And fundamentalism would become more sectarian, emphasizing very much in-group membership, and would continue to splinter. It would focus on legalism as opposed to what it saw as the loosening morality of society as a whole, but this would extend to such things as drinking alcohol, dancing, card playings, etc. And most of the movement would become increasingly dispensational, or focusing on an understanding of the Christian Bible such that the two peoples of God are separated, the Jew and the Gentile, seeing a hard discontinuity between Old and New Testament, and focusing on a pessimistic view of the world, that the world will get worse and worse until Christ returns, which will be marked by a rapture, and 7 years of tribulation, in which the very chaotic things will happen until Christ comes to judge. These ideas would make many fundamentalists give up on the prospect of engaging with redeeming Christian cult or American culture at the time. The Fundamentalist-Modernist controversy is only one of the many facets of the Christian church between 1910 and the Second World War. There's also a growing increase in kind of national Christianity as it's tied to the engagement of America in both the First World War and the Second World War. Now I'd like to turn to some of these changes that came about after the Second World War. There were many things leading up to this. The 1920s have many of its own understandings. In the 1930s, with the Depression, had a deep impact on the American psyche. But the war itself became, in some ways, a victory for the US in a way it wasn't for any other nation. Because World War II gave America an opportunity to play a leading role on the world stage, and although it cost many American lives, the American mainland and infrastructure was not affected by the war. So after World War II, America emerged as one of only two great superpowers left, them and Soviet Russia. The post-war years saw great optimism in America because of unprecedented economic growth and various changes that were coming about in American society through technology and general prosperity. Because of all this, as I said, optimism was reigning. America was entering into its new century. It would be the leader of the world. But at the same time, despite this optimism and these new hopes for technology and the advancing of American interests throughout the world, you also saw the beginning of the Cold War as the United States was pitted against communist Soviet Union. And both of these forces would deeply affect not just American society, but the church as well. I want to begin by looking at some of the material factors that shifted understandings of the church itself in this period. We often think of history as a series of people doing things, and that causes various events to occur. And it definitely is that. But there are also structural and technological issues that produce changes in society that cannot really be predicted at the outset. I'm going to look at a few of these throughout the lecture. The first I want to mention is the rise of the suburbs. So after World War II, because of various acts by the US Congress and the general economic growth and migration of people from the countryside into the cities, you see a whole new rise of suburbia. And this was an attempt to give many of the GIs returning from the war new places to live that were single home families, subsidized into zones, and with their own kind of internal structures, such as shopping malls that we think of today. Now you might think, why does this have a big idea? Well, this fundamentally changes the nature and structure of American society. You begin to have a higher concentration of upper middle class whites in the suburbs, and their churches follow with them. So not only do you have what's called white flight from the centers of many American population centers, leaving those without a tax base and therefore causing urban decay, which primarily affected the poor and minorities, you also have a migration of most of the churches into the suburbs. And therefore, what was already a segregated nation by law in the South became a de facto segregation all over the country, not just by race, but also by economic standards. And this has great changes in the church. The already segregated church becomes more so, and people have now left the kind of normal, stable part of their life, where a community would be organized around a church that would have regional affiliations. Another aspect of the 50s that changed this fundamentally was the rise of the automobile and what I'm calling the mobile society. After the war, 20 million Americans moved from rural to urban areas, and this has all sorts of effects on their understanding of religion, their own place, and their own identity. But also the mass ownership of automobiles would change the dynamic of church going for the rest of this time. If you notice the chart to my left, you see the massive spike in automobile ownership into the 1950s and 60s. How would this matter? Well, it changes where you're going to look for a church and how you're going to relate to that community. Instead of going to the church that is local to you, which is very easily accessible, and having loyalty to that church, people can now seek out churches within 20 or 30 miles of their home. And so now what you get are commuter churches. And this has many good aspects to it, at least not bad ones, but what it does is it creates an increased sorting of people. People begin choosing churches not necessarily by doctrine or proximity or relationship to their community, but because of preference. And this accentuates what we've talked about before in the American context, which is that the American church works on a market model. So churches are incentivized to create eye-catching services, eye-catching buildings, so that they can get people coming in to worship with them. Likewise, this car ownership weakens discipline. Now, you might not think why, but church discipline becomes extremely difficult in an age where if you have some sort of issue with the church, instead of sticking it out because it's part of your community, you're intimately and organically connected to its people and its place. If you have a problem with the church, you can always go to one of the 7 that are on your way to your church anyway. So I bring this out just to note that some of the changes that happen in Christianity throughout the 20th century are not really caused necessarily by ideas or individual human choices, but structural and technological causes shift the nature and complexion and inflection of the church throughout this period. Okay, so let's move on to discuss American civil religion in the 1950s. We've already discussed that in the 1920s and 30s, Christianity fell out of favor with most of the intellectual class. This was exacerbated by much of the Great Depression, which was not seen, the churches were not really able to do much at the time because of the lack of funds. However, after the war, and especially from 1945 to 1960, church membership exploded and rose twice as fast as population growth. In fact, the 1945 to 1960 is probably the highest percentage of church membership in American history. We've seen throughout the period before times of decline and revival. In some ways, this was a time of increase, but not so much revival. Instead, what we see happening here is American civil religion, some kind of vague Judeo-Christian tradition, is adopted as a mark of respectability and the American way of life. Why do I say the Judeo-Christian tradition? After the war, the inflection of public discourse on religion was not so much Christian as the invocation of the Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic faiths. It became completely non-sectarian, not just to the extent that it's not favoring Protestants or Catholics, but it's even not privileging Christianity. The Jewish people of the time, especially after the Holocaust, are welcomed in as an essential pillar of the American religious landscape, which is not a bad thing, but it changes the complexion about the default of American religious thought, such that many figures and politicians will invoke a vague concept of theism, however, without any deeper Christian sentiment to it. We can see both this increase and its kind of bland theistic character with 2 events that happened in the mid-1950s. In 1954, Under God is added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and in 1956, In God We Trust is made the national motto. Notice what's being said here. Under God. That idea can be filled in with whatever one wants. That God may be the triune God, or it may be Yahweh, understood in the Jewish religion, or it can be anything else. So we have a general American religion focused on a broad, inclusive theism without much depth to it. So politicians will invoke God. They will invoke religion. They'll invoke its power to sustain moral integrity of communities. But they will not invoke Jesus. They will not invoke Christian doctrine. And so you have in the 1950s a veneer of religiosity that is not itself Christian, but really only a small film. So the civil religion of the 1950s was, as I said, not Christianity, but a generic Abrahamic theism that was meant to undergird the society itself. So religion here is whether or not they understood it being used as a means to support other ends, such as democracy, free enterprise, humanitarian efforts, and the general optimism of the time. America felt at the top of the world, having defeated the great scourge of Nazism, and anything was possible as far as the mainstream was concerned. And to give sense to this, we have this idea of religious underpinning. But again, it is not particularly Christian, but merely religious. We can see this in something that President Eisenhower said before he took office in 1952. In the New York Times, he was quoted as saying, "Our government has no sense unless it is founded on deeply felt religious faith. I don't care what it is." So notice, the point here is religious faith itself, not the object of what that faith is. Religion in this period was also just emphasizing the difference of America with its Cold War nemesis, namely the Soviet Union. The so-called Christian nature or Judeo-Christian nature of America and its pushing in the popular mindset was a response to the so-called godless communism of the USSR. It was a way to set America over against Russia and the rest of the world and give it a sense of identity and national purpose, thereby in kind of bringing together this vague Christianity that's always been present, kind of invoking the ghost of that Protestant ethos we talked about from the 19th century, combining that with capitalist understandings and the economic boon, and giving America an identity. So in some ways, this is a re-envisioning of America as city on a hill that we saw from the colonial period. And for the people, church membership became a mark of the respectability and part of the American way of life, as opposed to communism, as opposed to radicals. So as the country got wealthier, it became more religious, but not necessarily in a sense that was deeply held religious faith. Many people would have shared Eisenhower's understanding that faith was very important, whatever it might be in. And you can see this through various kind of movements throughout the 50s, but I won't get into too much detail. One of the main benefactors of this were the mainline churches. Mainline here is being used as the distinction from what will become evangelicalism. The post-war period was the height of the mainline and saw many mergers to form what would become the mainline denominations today. So this optimism of general society was led into optimism in the churches itself. Now these mergers were not primarily produced by resolving theological issues between various denominations. How they were more produced by a growing sense of indifferentism to doctrinal specificity. So it is the liberal theology of the 20s and 30s that downplays doctrine that allowed many of these denominations to come together, not in terms of a unified confession of faith, which was lowered, but a unified praxis for social action, for community, and all around Jesus. But that definition of Jesus had become, in the mainline, often as vague as that of God, primarily in the institutional form and the pastors, not so much in the people in the pews. To give some examples of these mergers, the UCC, the United Church of Christ, was formed in 1957, bringing together several Methodist denominations and the German Reformed Church that had dated back to the colonial period. In 1958, the United Presbyterian Church in the USA is formed. This would later become the PCUSA as it merged with the Southern Presbyterian Church in 1983. The Lutheran Church in America would be formed, bringing together various ethnic Lutheran churches, especially in the north around Minnesota and Michigan, Wisconsin areas. This would later become the ELCA, or Evangelical Lutheran Church. The evangelical there is tricky because this is not an actual evangelical church, but is mainline. And also in 1968, you would have the formation of the United Methodist Church. Spirits were very high in the mainline in the 1950s. You can see from the chart to my left an increased membership from 1955 to 1965. In fact, 1965 was the height of the membership of the mainline as a whole. This was due both to new members entering the church, especially those who had moved up in social standing would begin to go to church as a way of demonstrating that respectability. There was also sincere faith, don't get me wrong here. But there was also an increase in birth because this was the time of the so-called baby boom. And the mainline itself would serve as the informal established religion in America. They would be the guardians, of some sense, of that broad Judeo-Christian inheritance, the kind of the priests of the civil religion. But this was a Christian faith that had already accommodated itself to modernity, making some of the essential doctrines that we've seen from the early church, the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of Christ's divinity, the importance of the sacrificial death of Christ for sin or conversion in the 19th century American revivalist context. All of those would be put down. This is, in some ways, just a 1950s version of von Harnack's view of the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the infinite worth and self-worth at this point of the human soul. You also see a corresponding rise in this chart of the conservative Protestant denominations, or what would become evangelicalism. We're going to look at the decline of the mainline in a bit more, but it's also in the 1950s that the evangelical movement arises. So this evangelical movement came out of what we've already seen with the fundamentalists. But this new generation of fundamentalists rejected its sectarianism, its anti-intellectualism, and its cultural isolation. One of the first people leading this charge was Carl Henry, who would be one of the founders of Christianity Today, in his work, The Uneasy Conscience of Fundamentalism in 1947. And what he was doing here was calling for all these things of fundamentalism that had gone astray. Not the doctrine. He wanted to maintain an orthodox Christian faith, but wanted to reclaim this idea that evangelicalism should be active within the society. And he wanted to call for a comprehensive Christian worldview in order to engage in both evangelism, but also apologetics and intellectual work. His efforts, amongst with many others, would lead to a resurgence of conservative Protestant religion in America through the 50s, but really leading up even to the 90s. One of the most important figures in this resurgence of evangelicalism, which was an intentional rebranding, by the way. The theology hadn't really changed from the fundamentalists. It was more posture, and it was more posture towards the world and towards one another. And evangelical became a rebranding attempt to let go of some of the bad connotations of fundamentalists that had been produced from the 20s and 30s. One of the most significant and important figures for American culture in this period and for evangelicalism was Billy Graham, who was born in 1819 and just recently passed away. His ministry began even in the early 1940s with Youth for Christ and many other parachurch organizations. Graham himself came from Wheaton College, which at this time and subsequently throughout this period would grow as one of the centers of intellectual thought in American evangelical Christianity. He was ordained as a Baptist minister, and throughout his career, which would be way too long to get into here, he would preach to millions, calling them to make a decision for Christ. So in some ways, with Billy Graham, we see another updating of the revivalist tendencies within American Christianity. He would utilize all media that was available to him, including radio, including television, and would preach not only throughout America, but throughout the world. One of the most significant early events that led him to national prominence was the 1949 LA Crusade. Graham held a tent revival that lasted 8 weeks, and he received national and even international media attention. Partially, this was through the work of the newspaper magnate Hearst, who actually informed and told his reporters to give Graham good press. And so Graham would end up preaching to millions, and many would make a decision for Christ. Graham was working much with the same revival methods that we've already seen with Moody in Sunday. He wasn't that concerned with doctrinal precision, as many of the older fundamentalists had been, and therefore he was criticized by them for his willingness to engage in broader ecumenical events. As his ministry developed, he would loosen his ties with his former fundamentalist allies and would begin to preach crusades alongside Catholics and even mainline groups. One of the differences between the Graham Crusades and the earlier revivals was its organization. He would make sure that many Protestant churches in the town supported this crusade. They would do all the legwork beforehand, creating committees to set up times, to get the message out, to use advertising, to guarantee that many people would come. And he would give the very simple gospel message. You are a sinner in need of the saving work of Christ. And then at the end, he'd give them a decision card that they could mark if they wanted to make a decision for Christ. And then they would be contacted by local churches. So this is very much in the same vein as much of the revivalism before, but its success is quite remarkable. Graham would also run into issues with Southerners because of his opposition to the segregation of his events. This is a theme we're going to be coming back to. Despite this increase in church membership of the 1950s, many of the problems of the earlier American period, such as segregation and Jim Crow, were still very much present, and in the 50s were largely plastered over by mainstream white culture. Let's take a moment to think about what evangelicalism is. This is a term that even in our own day, and maybe especially in our own day, is becoming less clear and less evident. doesn't merely mean conservative Protestant. Well, in some contexts, but not necessarily. Evangelicalism is a broader term than a denomination. It's a kind of emphasis in Christology. One historian of evangelicalism has put it this way, known as David Bebbington, in the work Evangelicalism in Modern Britain that you see above me. And Bebbington has offered what most people call the Bebbington quadrilateral, which is attempting to capture the theological emphases of the evangelical movement. The first being biblicism, now not in the negative way that I talked about last time, but as a particular regard for the authority and truth of the Bible. So the Bible is the center of evangelical faith, largely connected also with the concept of inerrancy, although not exclusively. So there's a focus on the Bible. There is a crucicentrism. That means a focus on the atoning work of Christ on the cross. Because evangelicalism focuses on the nature of sin, repentance, and redemption, the cross becomes the center point of all evangelical preaching and emphasis. And this is tied with the third element, which is conversionism, the belief that human beings need to be converted or born again, which will become a common name for evangelicals in the 1970s. Many of these emphases had already been eroded in the mainline church, looking not at the Bible alone, but seeing it as merely one book of human religious experience. A changing of the cross from a substitutionary death to merely an exemplar model of showing us either God's love or the problems with violence or whatever. And a reluctance to engage in conversion. In much of the 1950s, as we saw on the missions field last time, there was a growing uncomfortableness in the mainline and liberal theology for actually calling someone to become a Christian because there was a lack of confidence that you were potentially in danger of eternal damnation if you didn't. But evangelicals were very clear on this, and this is in some ways where the concept of fire and brimstone preaching came in, although Graham didn't really get into that much. Bebbington gives a fourth qualification, or a fourth characteristic of evangelicalism, activism, which I think is very important to understand. This is that the belief that the gospel needs to be expressed in holy living and social action. Now, throughout most of the evangelicals' time, this has been expressed through converted people acting rightly in society. So it's largely an individual understanding. But evangelicals are to be converted. They're supposed to follow the Bible, accept the cross, and then live that out in active life. Okay, so far in the 50s, we've seen this broad Christian, Judeo-Christian consensus and the rise of both the mainline and evangelical Protestants. Let's sum up this a little bit and see some of these aspects more clearly. So the post-war church was broadly marked by trends in American thought more generally. It was very anti-communist. It imbibed American exceptionalism and patriotism. The idea that this was the American way of life was to be Christian, to go to church. And this was a way to counterpose it to the communist narrative, which was officially atheistic. And the church itself is marked with optimism and the idea of progress, both on mainline and evangelical. These ideas resulted in this broad Judeo-Christian consensus marked by general respect for and deference to religion in both culture and the public life. So in some ways there was a de facto established Christianity in the 1950s. Not that it was the official church or anything like that, but in some ways it's a reemergence of that Protestant ethos of the 19th century, but now updated in a more mainline way and to the use of America in the Cold War. This was, as I said, the height of church membership and the Christian consensus, yet there were many things in the 1950s that showed a deep contradiction in American culture and produced anxiety and divisions that would come to flower in the 1960s. We still had massive segregation, especially in the South where it was legally mandated, but also in the North in terms of schools. In the 1950s, and kind of behind all of this glitzy new technology, new suburbs and cars and kind of perfect Norman Rockwell kind of life, was a deep anxiety and a continued discussion of a lack of a national purpose. What was America for? What were they to do with this new superpower status? What were they to do with this newfound wealth? This caused a lot of anxiety, especially amongst the public intellectuals. And this was also a worry about growing consumerism and the shallowness of popular culture. Much of this can be expressed by such films as James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause. This was this growing sense that you see in American youth of a lack of direction. Like, Rebel Without a Cause is saying he's rebelling, but he actually doesn't have any purpose. There is no clear direction. It is rebellion for the sake of rebellion, which can only really happen in a culture of economic affluence and lacking kind of a basic unified American narrative at the time. So all of these things were nagging at the edges of this Christian consensus. And this led to also the privatization of religion. So while there was the general consensus, your own beliefs, your own personal relationship to God, whether what you filled in with "in God we trust," right, was supposed to be part of your private life. It was just one area. You would go to the Kiwanis Club one night, you'd go to the country club the next night, and then you'd go to church on Sunday. But that's where it belonged. And so religion, as we kind of saw with Eisenhower, was a good thing to have. Just don't get too serious about it. So at the same time in the 50s, we have this general Christian consensus, and yet this movement of Christianity and religion is just one part of your life, and you should have that box checked along with all the other new avenues of leisure, work, hobbies, etc. Okay, so 1950s has a lot of issues under the surface. And to show this privatization of religion, I want to move to what President Kennedy said leading up to his election in 1960. So Kennedy was very important because he was the first Catholic president of the United States. And if you know much about American history, there was a long history of anti-Catholic sentiment throughout the country. The worry here was because, especially before Vatican II, which we'll talk about next time, most Americans didn't want a president who had a fundamental allegiance beyond the borders of the nation. They were worried that a Catholic president would bow to the teachings and the dictates of the Pope on controversial issues. See, in fact, they were saying Catholics don't work like us Protestants. We can just have our own conscience and do what we want. We're worried that a Catholic president will abide by his religious convictions in all ways of life and threaten, therefore, the kind of broad Protestant ethos of the nation. So in order to get elected, Kennedy had to assuage these fears. And by doing so, he really tips his hand to the changing shape of American religion itself. Many Catholics did not like this speech. Let's see what he says. He says, "But let me stress again that these are my views. For contrary to common newspaper usage, I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me. Whatever issue may come before me as president on birth control, divorce, censorship, gambling, or any other subject, I will make my decision in accordance with these views, in accordance with what my conscience tells me to be the national interest, and without regard to outside religious pressures or dictates. And no power or threat of punishment could cause me to decide otherwise." In this, I think Kennedy is not being cynical. I think he's buying that religion is a separate individual part of his life, and as a politician and as a president, national interests and his job override the church's dictates. I feel like this in the time was a deeper sentiment amongst the population itself, that I do not speak for the church, nor does the church speak for me, came to be kind of this general sentiment amongst American Christians. And all of these contradictions, the segregation, anxiety about national purpose, consumerism, and the privatization of religion, would come to a head in the 1960s and 70s in the various cultural revolutions. We're going to discuss them briefly and look at some of their contours without getting into all of it. So the 1960s and 70s, and what I'm calling the Cultural Revolution, challenged this Christian consensus of the post-war period. It challenged the anti-communism with various movements in the 1960s, such as the student protest movements, many of which were very openly communists, many calls for communist revolution from radicals throughout the society, which caused many people to be very alarmed by this. There was challenges to American exceptionalism because of anti-patriotic sentiments, and especially connected to the Vietnam War, which challenged American exceptionalism on two ways. First, as America was seen to be losing the war, this post-World War II optimism was shattered. We could defeat Nazi Germany, but this small country in Southeast Asia was eating up our sons. This really put a halt to a lot of the optimism of the time, and the rejection of the war by the anti-war movement challenged the very notion of patriotism itself. And this brings us to the destruction of optimism in progress-oriented society. Progress, as it was understood in the 1950s, was very much kind of pitched in terms of economic growth and increase in consumer products. This changed to a sort of radical secular utopianism of the 1960s counterculture. You can think of various examples, the hippies, etc. This ultimately all comes to naught, as the 1960s are both an era of increased personal expression, but also a list after list of terrible events that shook the nation time and time again, especially the events of 1968 with the assassination of MLK and Robert Kennedy, as well as the later Kent State shooting in 1970. These are just momentary things, some of the most important, but month after month, various radical events would shape and kind of beat down the optimism that was previously present in the 1950s. That would lead us to the 1970s, which I think is well described as a hangover of the hope and promise of the 1960s, with economic stagnation, with the Watergate scandal, with the oil shock, and many other things. So we're not going to talk much about the 70s, but I think thinking of it as a hangover for the 60s is quite accurate. The 1960s and 70s are important because they bring many of those contradictions that are already present in American culture to a head. Sometimes both for good ramifications and other times ill. We're going to look briefly at civil rights, the theological crisis of the 1960s, at least a symbolic element of it, the various cultural shifts that changed the public perception, not just of Christianity, but morality itself, and we're going to end with a brief discussion of the decline of the mainline churches. The civil rights movement exposed the contradiction of American liberty as it was expressed in the 1950s and before, as they hailed America as a bastion of freedom against godless communism. A large section of our own population was refused equality before the law, and we perpetuated segregation. This was beginning to be chipped away in the 1950s, even with the verdict of Brown versus Board of Education from the Supreme Court, which desegregated schools. However, this was a very controversial thing, with racism being a very prominent feature of American life, especially in the U.S. South. It should be noted that many churches did not support desegregation, and many of the Christian schools that we support and prize today, which we should, were actually the product of Southerners trying to avoid the desegregation of their schools. So as we think about the failure of the church, the white church in this area, we need to just own up that it did not act properly or in a fully Christian manner in this period. The civil rights movement would move primarily from the black church with support from the mainline at various times. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference would be founded in 1957, and this network of churches would be promoted and founded by MLK to bring about changes in the law and civil rights. Various means of peaceful protests were used, such as sit-ins at lunch counters that were initially segregated, freedom riders throughout the South that were both white and blacks trying to show the failure of the American segregation system, its immorality, by peaceful protests that would produce violent reactions by Southern officials, which now with the new medium of television were broadcast throughout the nation, showing the nature of the oppression of these periods. One of the most kind of poignant of them was the Birmingham campaign in 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. was himself imprisoned, and he wrote his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, in which he chastises the white pastors of Birmingham for their failure to see the call of equality from their fellow brothers and sisters. Much of the civil rights movement in the early 60s culminated for the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, in which Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I want us to focus in on this speech for a moment because it interestingly ties together what we've been talking about in other parts of the class, how MLK invokes the Christian consensus in order to bring to light to white America the contradictions founded in how they're treating their black brothers and sisters. So let's move into a couple of snippets from this speech. I'm going to let MLK do this through audio recordings because he's a great orator, and I think you need to hear how he delivers these lines to see their connection. So let's do that.
I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spirit, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
So we see from MLK's discussion here how he is actually leveraging the Christian consensus of the 1950s to point out that it's not actually a consensus, that many people, especially the African American community, have been left out of the broad Christian and the broad national life. And he does this by invoking various things. He connects it to patriotism. Notice the American dream idea that he then roots back in the original founding liberties of the Declaration of Independence. So we see here an American Christianity being leveraged against American Christianity to bring it to recognition. Notice we also see the broad Abrahamic theism in how he invokes both Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics. He's calling for a non-sectarian Christianity to be the underpinning, kind of the moral conscience of the nation, invoking many of those themes that we've seen already in the 1950s. And he's wrapping this all together with the black church's emphasis on freedom and liberation from the Exodus story that we discussed before. We see this at the end with his invocation of the spiritual, that's free at last, free at last. That is the freedom of the Exodus and the liberation of society. So as we see the religious roots of the civil rights movement, which could be multiplied indefinitely, we see how it actually fits very much as a outworking of the 1950s Christian consensus being leveraged for the promotion of Christian equality in America itself. However, while MLK was invoking the de facto religious establishment in service of civil rights, this silent consensus was coming apart in America. So this moves us into the 1960s and 70s and the crisis of liberal theology. The kind of broad optimism and the neo-orthodoxy that was prevalent in the 1950s, we'll talk about the nature of neo-orthodoxy next time, was breaking down, and the confidence of liberal theology was largely shattered in the 1960s. The God is dead theology is an indication of this. You see above the cover of Time magazine for April 8, 1966, that asked the rather provocative question, is God dead? A number of theologians, primarily from Emory in Atlanta, declared that God had ceased to be useful for religion. He had no place in society of the modern world, and theology itself, reflections on the ultimate, on existence, had to move on without God because it was no longer a proposition that was needed. One of the articles in this 1970s or 1960s magazine states that we need to stop talking about God for a while. Stick to what the Bible says. Formulate a new image and concept of God using contemporary thought categories, or simply point the way to areas of human experience that indicate the presence of something beyond man and life. This was in an essay called Towards the Hidden God. Now I want to indicate that this God is dead, the death of God theology, as it was later called, was not in itself significant. This was a couple theologians, it got a lot of press, but didn't really produce anything long term. But it is a clear indication of the shift in theology and culture of this period. The question, is God dead, in the 1950s would have seemed absurd with record numbers of church membership. But by the 60s, that has declined rapidly. And this general sense that we all abide by some general Christian mores, that even though one might not be religious, it's still a respectable thing. It's rational. There was kind of a backlash from the cultural rejection of 1920s and 30s, comes to be emptied very quickly. And this is part of a larger element of the 1960s, of cultural shifts away from Christian morality, away from Christian theology, and ultimately away from the church. We can see this in the various cultural shifts of the 1960s that were really unprecedented in their magnitude. They focused on the maximalization of personal autonomy and self-expression and the rejection of all traditional authorities. If you see that, you see that this is very much an Enlightenment product, but not the kind of rational enlightenment that we saw before, but a very much enlightenment of experience, not empiricism, but personal fulfillment, self-actualization. This is being propelled by such philosophical movements as existentialism and various other figures. In the 1960s, American culture, especially pop culture, as it shifts to youth culture away from the traditional, the stable, the orderly, is about radical individualism. You do you comes from the 60s. Anti-establishment, which we see in many of the protest movements and the growing distrust of the man or the establishment, and a general loosing of cultural mores throughout the society. If you see above me, I just note this in the shift of the Beatles from 1963 until 1973, 1963 to 1967. As the Beatles come over from Liverpool in the early 1960s and are on the Ed Sullivan Show, they were a sensation. But at the time, notice how clean cut they are. They maybe have a little moppy hair for the time, but that is about it. They're wearing suits. They're clean shaven, and some of their biggest songs are things such as "We All Live in a Yellow Submarine," general nonsense, or "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which is a very platonic and safe love ballad. To the later 60s, where you notice everything has changed. They have adopted the counterculture persona and are actually one of the propellants of it. As their music continues, it'll move into the drug culture and the psychedelic movement of the late 60s. This shift was remarkably fast. It was driven by youth, and it was this shift in American society that is just really hard to fathom. I'm going to talk about a couple of these cultural shifts and how they affected the church before moving on. The most significant, maybe, is the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which was propelled by new technology, such as the pill. I would argue that the pill is, that is the birth control pill, is one of the most disrupted technologies of the past 3 centuries. This unleashes new avenues of sexuality and sexual expression that before this time were deeply guarded by traditional authority and consequences. The pill allowed sexuality to be divorced purely from procreation, in a way that other forms of contraception did not do. Many of the forces unleashed by the pill, the increased sexual liberation across the spectrum, would also lead to the ideas of no-fault divorce in the 1970s. To understand this is kind of hard, but it is one of those structural causes in history. When the pill came about, no one could have predicted the kind of earth-shattering way it would reconstruct our society. Now, it wasn't just the pill itself. It's combined with many other cultural and social forces, but it is one of those things that allowed the society to become what it would. This is what I want to stress here. These sorts of movements, and the sexual revolution in generally, detached marriage and sex from procreation. The idea that sexuality was that which had a telos and a purpose to perpetuate generations, to create stable communities, gets set aside. And marriage and sex itself are transformed in the ideas of the culture as just another consumer good that is aimed at self-fulfillment. So the end of marriage and sex no longer is something other, something towards creation of life or creation of stability in terms of marriage, but both of their ends become the self. And in this, we see something that is unprecedented in human history. The sexuality is removed from the moral arena for many people and removed from the perpetuation of family and society to being a purely private good that is outside the bounds of morality itself. And the implications of the sexual revolution, which is much more complicated than I'm discussing today, would resound throughout the rest of the 20th century and still is being worked out in our own period. Tied to the sexual revolution is second wave feminism, which offers many goods in the 1960s and 70s. The feminist revolution and feminist liberation comes out of the civil rights movement and is including trying to give women equal representation and rights within society. This movement exposed various forms of discrimination and supported passage of laws to outlaw them and offered many other protections for women. Also, second wave feminism offers many helpful intellectual tools for critical reflection on sexism. However, it also unleashed unexpected and unintended consequences throughout society, especially some more radical feminists and vocal leaders argued that religion itself, Christianity and marriage, were only products of and the perpetuators of women's oppression. So therefore, we get the concept of the patriarchy and the rejection of all male leadership as innately oppressive, or at least potentially so. And not to say that it's not definitely potentially so, but it creates just a fundamentally new environment and questioning of gender roles in society. And not that that's all bad, but it does shake up the very cultures of American ideas. And this is also something we're still working with. How does gender and sexuality work in a post-Christian society, which is ultimately where the 60s and the 70s will lead us. In Christian theological circles, feminism would lead to, by some theologians, to what is known as feminist theology. Now, I want to be clear, feminist theology is not theology done by feminists. Feminist theology is a specific method that argues that the Bible and traditional theology itself have been patriarchal because they've been done by men, and therefore what is needed is a new theology that takes the liberation of women as both its starting point and its end goal. Some of the more radical proponents, such as Elizabeth Johnson and Rosemary Radford Ruether, argued that women have a very different and fundamentally different understanding of God and the world, and theology must start from their knowledge and overturn the patriarchy found in the Bible and in the churches. This moves to rather radical positions, such as Elizabeth Johnson's call to cease to call God Father, for instance, or Ruether's attempt to say that what is true in Christian theology is that which leads to the liberation of women, and anything that does not is by definition false. So we notice here that this becomes a unique methodology which goals our liberation of women, and that is the norm for the theology itself. This is connected with the themes of liberation theology coming out of Latin America, and we talked about last time with Gustavo Gutierrez. So these are just two of the massive cultural shifts. They could be multiplied many times, but these all have very deep effects on the church and forces her to reflect much deeper on how to articulate our theology in a world where Christian understandings of morality, of sexuality, of the family, of knowledge itself are being called into question. It's in this period that we get to see the beginning of the decline of the Mainline. We saw in previous charts that 1965 was the peak membership of the Mainline Churches. However, as all of these cultural upheavals and shifts are happening, liberal theology is having trouble coping with them. The general liberal theology of the Mainline shifted from leading the culture in the 1950s as that de facto guardian to taking its cues from the culture and sanctifying the revolutions of the 1960s as the work of the Spirit in a rather uncritical way. And the denomination continued to move in a liberal direction in every theological sphere, especially on the denominational, structural, institutional levels. And there was an increased movement towards the liberal theology of accepting religious pluralism and or universalism, that all people are saved regardless of their religious persuasion, an increased adoption of women's ordination, and an adoption of progressive social causes as de facto necessary for the perpetuation of the gospel and the church. This turned off many people in the pews of a more conservative manner and led ultimately to the Mainline's decline. However, this posture, as I said, gave the Mainline nothing unique to say to the culture. By taking its cues from the culture, the Mainline kind of vacuated its position to have a unique message, because the message of Christ had been completely, in some ways, assimilated to the message of the age. The culture didn't need to listen to the church anymore, because what was it saying that we weren't always saying? In some ways, the church was behind. It was trying to give answers to the society's questions, but accepting that the society had the norms in which to accept them. Okay, it's kind of complicated. But from the 1960s onward, many members in the Mainline would stop identifying as Christian at all, because what was different between the Mainline Christianity and liberal theology than what they could get elsewhere? It was largely a matter of fellowship, which could be found in many other societies throughout the culture. And many others moved to conservative denominations. So if you notice in the chart to my left, in 1972, this is as the percentage of the U.S. population, so it's a very good indication of its actual standing within the culture. In 1972, mainline Protestantism made up roughly 30% of the U.S. population. By 2012, that had fallen to less than 15%. And this very rapid decline, which is a fundamental shift in American culture itself. We also notice a corresponding increase of evangelical Protestants, moving from roughly 18% in 1972 to just under 25% today. The most significant element of this chart is the rise in the so-called nuns, from that is, those who have no religious affiliation. That does not necessarily mean these people are atheists. In fact, many of them are not. But they are, in some ways, the general theists that we discussed from the 1950s, but feel no need to identify with any particular brand of it. This group of people, the nuns, rose from 5% in 1972 to over 20% and growing today. Most of these are those who have left the Mainline and evangelical churches, as well as many Catholics. The Catholic numbers that you see here, that remain roughly 25% of the population across these 40 years, they're losing lots of people, but being replenished from immigration, especially from Hispanic countries. So it's in this period, as the Mainline kind of loses its confidence, even in the efficacy of its liberal theology, that leads to its decline and continued falling throughout the rest of the 20th century. It's in the 1960s and the continual liberalization of theology within the Mainline Church that leads to several church splits and realignments, especially in the 70s, as conservatives left liberal churches and vice versa. So in 1975, a group of more liberal churches left the LCMS. It's an event known as perpetuated by something called Seminex in 1974, in which the LCMS, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, attempted to discipline its seminary in St. Louis for questioning inerrancy and several other issues. It's quite complicated, but they then created a seminary in exile, and several of the, over half of the professors left seminary. This caused much confusion. So this is an example of an alignment in which a left part of the church was forced out by a conservative element of the church. Similar alignment such as this, with a small liberal contingent leaving a more conservative church, occurred also in the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, in the 70s and 80s. Other examples of this could be made. This is also the time where the PCA was formed, as it split from the increasingly liberal PCUS, the Southern Presbyterian Church. This happened in 1973. Above you see a old black and white picture of the first PCA General Assembly on December 4th, 1973. This movement was citing concerns over growing liberal theology in the church, acceptance of abortion, and women's ordination. These were deeply feared by many of the conservatives within the Southern Church because of impending talks of merging with the Northern Presbyterian Church, which would later happen in 1983 to form the PCUSA. As I said, the Northern churches went liberal much more quickly, and the Southern churches were worried about the encroaching liberal theology from this, so they split away. This was not the only concern. These were the concerns on paper, and they were very valid, but there was also an undercurrent of racism and an attempt to continue to allow for segregation within the church. Not all the members of the early formation of the PCA did so, but there are several very vocal members who saw this as an attempt to preserve the Presbyterian Church as a predominantly white church and support church segregation. It's for many of these reasons that the Presbyterian General Assembly 2 years ago officially adopted a statement of repentance for the racial sins that were surrounding even the formation of the PCA and the inactivity of Southern Presbyterians during the Civil Rights era. Right, so the 60s were a very difficult time for the church. We see the shifting sands of culture in very unexpected ways. Sexual mores, moral behavior in all ways was redefined. The national identity itself was challenged. Church membership began to decline, and you had new philosophies such as existentialism taking hold of large parts of the culture. And this would inevitably cause a backlash. Much of the 70s are uneventful in terms of church history, generally. In the 1970s, the heady days of the 60s led to a general hangover and a decline in much of American optimism and hope for the future, especially after the defeat of Vietnam, the Watergate scandal with Nixon, etc. In the 1980s, we see that reaction come about with the rise of the religious right, or fundamentalism. Early fundamentalists and evangelicalism largely rejected too direct engagement in politics. So we see this in the early fundamentalists, and most early evangelicals, especially Billy Graham and others, while they would maybe touch on specific issues as individuals or write on it, there was no evangelical position in the political sphere. However, with the erosion of that Christian consensus, evangelicals emerged as a political bloc after 1976, which was declared by Newsweek to be the year of the evangelical. It's at this period that terms such as being born again enter into popular consciousness. One of the reasons for this was the election in 1976 of Jimmy Carter to be president, who was himself a professed born again evangelical. What was going on here is, after the erosion of this general American Christian consensus from the 1950s, which was rather unique in the history of America in its anti-communism, patriotism, and supporting of public morality, many evangelical leaders of the late 70s and early 80s had a nostalgia for this period and felt the need to bring the country back to its Christian roots. And this is a very complicated thing because they also pulled together this alliance with anti-communism, so Christian mission becomes innately capitalist. They bring in this patriotic message. This is where we get debates over America being a Christian nation, and disputes over the laxing morality of the public sphere. So in this, evangelicals trying to reclaim that de facto established church position that we saw in the 1950s that the Mainline had. Okay? And the rise of the religious right was really caused by the growing anxiety about the place of Christianity in America and concerns over the decline of American morality. This is an attempt to regroup after the 1960s and all of the cultural revolutions and upheavals at the time. And many evangelicals would point to a shifting legal and cultural feeling of Christianity at the time. For instance, in 1963, prayer was banned in public schools, and in 1973, Roe versus Wade legalizes abortion. These things would make many evangelicals no longer feel at home in the broader culture of America. So just to get yourself in this mindset, and to remember that there are people in your congregation who lived through this and probably experienced it. When you were growing up, you prayed at school every day, led by the teacher. You saluted the flag, you said under God. You'd go to your local church, which nobody thought was odd or strange. Every week, you could talk about your faith. You might get a little weird looks if you were too evangelical, but you were accepted. So this was your growing up. Christianity was openly discussed in the media. It was seen as an intellectual option, and this general Christian consensus was allowable within society. You move to 1980. There is no more prayer in school, something that you think is an abominable practice. Abortion is now a legal practice in the land. The intellectual class of your society has now deemed your simple faith not just backwards, but potentially dangerous for the world itself. This was extremely disequilibrating, confusing, anxiety-producing for large swaths of the American population. And moving back into then that evangelical activism that we saw previously in the 19th century, the rise of the religious right was an attempt to bring back America to what they thought it should be in line with Christianity. However, they did not really account for the fact that most of the rest of the society had moved on and did not want to move back to a nostalgic, kind of picturesque view of the 50s that never really was. And in this, we see a couple organizations that are important. James Dobson's Focus on the Family, which was formed in 1977, which sought to promote family values within the society. And very important was also the formation of what was known as the Moral Majority by Jerry Falwell in 1979. These two figures and several others were, and still are by many people, considered de facto leaders of the evangelical movement. And there would be lots of controversy about this as it moved into the 90s. These groups in 1980 supported Ronald Reagan for president, in some ways bringing together all these concerns we discussed. Reagan was anti-communist very clearly. He promoted American exceptionalism and in some ways American nostalgia with his, This is Morning in America. It was a callback to the nostalgia of the 1950s, a reset after the hangover of the 70s. And it's at this moment that evangelicalism actually takes on a rather political bent to it. This begins the trend of white evangelicals especially, and some conservative Catholics supporting the Republican Party, which is a pretty massive shift in the political tendencies of evangelicalism up to this point. Before 1976, there was really no de facto religious affiliation with evangelicals. They were left-right, that it was much more clean then. But what happens after the Reagan election? Evangelicals move into the Republican camp. The Democratic camp, seeing that they cannot win evangelicals, shift away from all their concerns and broadly leave a large swath of that electorate inaccessible to them. And so they change the climate of their own party so that evangelicals are not necessary to win elections because they've been voting Republican. When that happens, when a large section of the population is captured in some ways by one party and the other parties become less hospitable to it, then the party that captures it also doesn't care about its interests because it's basically stuck. There's nowhere else to go. And this is largely what happened to the white evangelical population from the 1980s onward. And it's something that, especially in the past 15 years, American evangelicals have been trying to sort out. There's much more that could be said here, and it's rather complicated. But I think the summary of critiques offered to the religious right that A&S present is quite apt. They say, quote, "The most legitimate charges, some of which were made by evangelicals, were that the movement blamed others for society's ills, idealized the American past, merged God's priorities with those of the nation, and emphasized individual morality while ignoring social injustice." I think all of those are fair criticisms of most of the religious right at the time and continued concerns for us today. I do want to stress, however, we need to think about these things historically. It is really hard to think of what else could they have done. And I just want to leave that to you with the question. I think all these criticisms are quite apt. And the need to think well about political theology is still something that remains with us today, because this path ultimately, kind of the God and country, restore the Christian consensus, does not seem to be a viable political or even cultural option today. But as I think back to this period, I want to give them a fair shake and just think about, were they doing the best they could despite many of the issues going on? So I'll leave you with that question. I'm pondering it myself. Another important movement of the 1980s for the church was the seeker-sensitive church movement. So this is also known as the church growth movement. What made this kind of very much the same as American practices in the church before, but slightly different, was using the most contemporary models in order to increase church attendance. We've seen this all the way back with Finney. We saw it in the urban revivals. We also saw it with Billy Graham a bit earlier. But the church growth movement utilizes different tools. It utilizes concepts of sociology, group dynamics, and business models in order to effectively grow the church. This becomes in some ways a technique to reach the unchurched with the proper advertising techniques, targeted demographic studies, and this leads to the broader element of the megachurch, which begins in the 1980s. I bring this up because this is a trend that has deeply affected the church across denominations and has been a very prominent movement in the 1980s. This shifted the broader white evangelical church towards informal worship, the development of church programs, non-denominationalism, which the idea of not being connected to a denomination really rises in the 1980s, and preaching that seeks to address felt needs. So this is also the introduction of a more therapeutic culture into American church preaching, and in some ways is a precursor of a trend in American Christianity that Christian Smith, a sociologist, has called moralistic therapeutic deism. Not that the church growth or seeker-sensitive movement intended to do so, but many of the emphases that we see in this 1980s movement that continue on to today kind of gave the sense that what God wants you to be is nice and happy. This is not to fault them entirely, but I think this emphasis is very important to note as we think about the state of the church today. Such examples are Willow Creek in Chicago, which was founded in the mid-80s, and Saddleback Church in California as well. Another unexpected outpouring of the 80s and 90s I want to note is the mainstreaming of dispensationalism. We've already mentioned dispensationalism as a prominent force in the fundamentalist churches in the 1920s. It was really initially popularized in America in 1906 with the Scofield Reference Bible, which pushed a dispensational reading of Revelation and the rest of the Bible to broad audiences as the first main study Bible in the country. But that had kind of died down, but through more popular works, dispensationalism became in some ways seen as the default, the Christian position in American Christianity and throughout the world through some unsuspecting means. So I'm stressing this to show you that we often think of those things that drive Christian culture as important intellectual, institutional things and individuals. We've already opened up today some unexpected causes, such as the technology of the automobile and the birth control pill. But I would argue that perhaps one of the most influential, not for good reasons, but influential books that touched on theology in the 20th century in America was in fact Left Behind. Now, it pains me to say this, but it is the truth. The way was primed for Left Behind in its mainstream dispensationalism by a previous book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey in 1970, which by 1990 had sold 28 million copies, which is a massive success in the book buying world. This kind of laid the groundwork for the dispensational novels of mainly targeted at young adults, 1995 of the first volume, Left Behind. And get this, the total sales for the series of Left Behind have surpassed 65 million copies. That is roughly one book of the Left Behind series for every 5 American citizens. These work would make dispensational premillennialism and such views as the rapture, the tribulation, and the support for the modern state of Israel, which is understood in dispensationalism as having a specific and unique role to play in the end times. These ideas would be perpetuated throughout American culture and would even influence American foreign policy, as Christians thought that the support for present-day Israel was a necessary Christian response. The reason I point this out is to many Christians and non-Christians alike, the views expressed in these books came to be understood as the Christian position on the end times, even though these doctrines and this configuration of dispensational premillennialism only dates to the 19th century. You can ask many people if they've ever heard of the rapture, and if they have, they most likely have these books to thank. And so theological influence can come from unexpected positions. This simple paperback novel that was supposed to be instructing people in theology, yes, but ended up shifting the theological character of a large part of the nation and perpetuating these ideas in what I would call folk theology throughout some time. And I feel like this has waned, but only for those who have sat down and thought about it. I think if you talk to most people and ask them about the rapture, they would think that that is something that the majority of Christians believe throughout time, which would not be the case. So we've looked at the 1980s, the reaction to the cultural revolutions of the 70s through the religious right, and some of these other movements in the 80s that continue to affect the church to today, the seeker-sensitive movement and the rise and mainstreaming of dispensationalism. I'm going to end my lecture today at 1990 with the fall of the USSR. Let me explain why I'm doing that. History is a tricky thing, and it takes time and perspective to understand the meaning of an era. What events really mattered, what things that we didn't realize were important turn out to be the defining element of that era. And 1990 seems to be about as far back as one can go with a clear objective historical purpose. History's meaning only emerges over time, and as we look back to the 90s, it's unclear, even at the moment, what the most significant things were. As I was reflecting on this lecture throughout this week, I was thinking about the state of the church in 1950 and 1960 and 1970, 1980, and realizing that had I been alive at any of those points, which I wasn't, there's no way I could have, even knowing everything that had happened before, could have predicted what 10 years later would look like. And that goes to show that historical causality, the influence of both technology, of individuals, and of broader social trends, is something that's very hard to expect. Add to that, of course, non-material causes, such as God's good pleasure and grace, makes the tracing and the projecting of church history and even the meaning of an era pretty hard to understand until one has had enough time to really sort it through. So we're going to end this lecture today in 1990 in the fall of the USSR. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later, the Cold War comes to an end. And you might wonder, why is this being brought up in a church history class? Well, the end of the Cold War left the US as the lone superpower and without any external threat that helped to shape and define cultural identity. Therefore, the energy that was generally directed at the Soviet Union and kept in some ways the various forces and coalitions of the United States together, that energy was turned more to internal conflict into the 1990s. So the early 90s would give rise to the so-called culture war between conservatives and liberals over the shape of American culture and identity. This would range from so many issues from gender roles to family values to questions of gay rights to the AIDS crisis to the teaching of American history in high schools, and it goes on and on and on. And this was much of the warp and wane of the 1990s and continued in some ways into the early 2000s. But I just want to note that this is where this comes from. And the kind of outworkings of it are still a bit unclear as to its causes, its meanings. But in some ways, this has defined the nature of the church for roughly the last 25 years. What does it mean to get our footing in an increasingly post-Christian culture? I think as we move into the 1990s, without America being defined as it was, this external force of so-called godless communism, defining the Christian nation, America as some sort of Christian nation over and against it, came to an end. And the forces of secularization and post-Christian culture were more opened up by this fall and let to run loose. And the church was continually having to react to it without a clear sense of where they were going. There was still this great disequilibrium amongst the churches of losing a culture that had actually been lost long ago. Problems of nostalgia and technique, etc., were very hard to come by. So I think 1990 could be very, very clearly stated as the end of Christian America. The end of that period in which Christianity had kind of a default privilege within the society, kind of a default state of this is more or less the default belief, even if you don't believe it's this that you don't believe. We saw that perpetuated throughout most of American history. Even though many weren't religious, there was a default Christian presuppositions going on. This was in some ways punctuated by the upswing in the 1950s that created not only this broad Christian consensus we've been discussing, but the 1950s are always held up as kind of the high point of American life. Now, that doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's kind of the story that we tell ourselves that gives it a lot of meaning. I think by 1990, with the rise of postmodernism, the end of the Cold War, and a new era of economic growth, we have an end to that Christian consensus as anything very meaningful within America. However, the end of Christian America does not mean the end of American Christianity, which of course continues today. There are many forces that we see going into that, and we'll discuss some of the global forces of that next time. I hope that this survey of 20th century American church history has helped you to see some of the various forces and trends and events that have shaped your own church and maybe even your own understanding of Christianity and its place in American society. Next time, we're going to look at our third lecture on the 20th century and move to Europe and look at what was going on in European theology at the time, the issues of Vatican II and the reshaping of the Catholic Church, and we'll briefly talk about evangelicalism and the future, or at least speculate slightly about trends moving forward from this point.